Imagine a massive enterprise operation, like a global logistics footprint, thousands of employees distributed across 3 continents, and millions in daily revenue that's completely reliant on real-time data flows.
Right, a massive scale.
Exactly. And suddenly, a core network switch in the primary data center just goes down.
Yeah.
And here is the kicker. Due to a legacy configuration oversight, there's absolutely no hardware redundancy built into that specific routing path.
Oh, wow. Total blackout.
Yeah. The entire global supply chain operation just halts. Silence. Ships can't be loaded. Trucks just sit idle.
Which is catastrophic.
Right. Or, perhaps even more insidious, imagine a chief financial officer sitting in a bustling international airport terminal. They boot up their laptop and connect to what they fully believe is the airline's executive lounge Wi-Fi network.
But it isn't.
No, it's an evil twin network. It's broadcast by a threat actor sitting just 3 rows away, silently and seamlessly intercepting the encrypted handshake. They're stripping the security protocols and capturing every single keystroke.
Every credential.
Exactly. Every administrative credential and every confidential corporate strategy document being drafted. I mean, let's unpack this, because in today's hyper-connected marketplace, these scenarios are not abstract IT hypotheticals.
No, they really aren't.
They're existential business crises.
That is exactly the reality corporate leaders are facing right now. We are operating in a landscape where the digital infrastructure isn't just, supporting the business. It is the actual backbone of the business.
Yeah, the literal foundation.
Exactly. And the moment that backbone fractures, whether through a hardware failure or a malicious intercept or a ransomware deployment, the business stops generating revenue, period.
Right.
And the margin for error is just shrinking every single day as enterprise architectures become more distributed and complex.
And that is exactly why you, as corporate leadership, have to stop viewing network architecture as just a technical cost center. You have to start viewing it as the primary theater of business risk.
Absolutely.
So, to ensure you are equipped with the strategic insights required to maintain a competitive edge and keep your enterprise assets secure in this hyper-connected marketplace, please make sure you like, subscribe, and share this deep dive.
It really is mandatory knowledge for modern governance.
It is, and definitely navigate to the description below to access the additional corporate resources, diagrams, and technical reading that supports what we are exploring today.
Yeah, because you just cannot effectively manage what you do not fundamentally understand at a structural level.
Well said. Which brings us to where we are in our curriculum. For those tracking with the series, this is Chapter 14 of our 15-chapter arc, specifically focusing on network security.
Right into the heavy stuff.
Yeah. Just to provide a quick strategic recap of our trajectory, in our previous chapter, Chapter 13, we covered network auditing, monitoring, and incident response. We broke down the operational mechanics of visibility.
Right. Setting up the radar.
Exactly. We looked at logging events and building resilient incident response runbooks. We essentially learned how to watch the network. Now, we are shifting from auditing the network to actively defending it.
We are moving from observation to actual fortification.
Exactly.
And the mission of this deep dive today is to bridge a very specific divide. We are taking highly technical academic networking principles like the protocols and the mathematical cryptographic standards and translating them into digestible, high-level corporate decision-making strategies.
Right. Connecting the engineering reality directly to the boardroom.
Precisely.
So let's start at the absolute foundation. Because if we're going to build a defense-in-depth architecture, we need to know exactly what the core objective is. In information systems, everything seems to trace back to the CIA Triad.
The 3 tenets of security.
All right. But I want to move past the textbook definitions here. How should a corporate manager or a modern CIO actually be operationalizing the concepts of confidentiality, integrity, and availability?
Well, it is the perfect starting point because every security control, every firewall policy, every endpoint agent you deploy is essentially a mechanism to enforce at least one of these 3 pillars.
Makes sense.
So let's look at confidentiality first. In a modern enterprise, confidentiality is not simply about hiding data or encrypting a hard drive. It is about the continuous dynamic restriction of access.
Okay.
It's the philosophy that no entity, whether human or machine, should have access to data unless it is explicitly required for their immediate function.
Right, because the moment you have flat permissions across a network, a single compromised workstation basically becomes a skeleton key for the entire enterprise.
Exactly. And the mechanism to prevent that is role-based access control, or RBAC. You map directory groups to specific business functions, but confidentiality also requires enforcing the state of the data.
Meaning encryption.
Yeah. Ensuring data is encrypted both at rest and in transit. And this is where operational breakdowns happen constantly.
I see this all the time. An organization spends millions on a next-generation firewall, but then a mid-level manager exports a highly sensitive financial spreadsheet and just emails it to a third-party consultant.
Using standard, unencrypted email over the public internet.
Exactly.
And in that single click, the confidentiality tenet is completely shattered. The firewall did its job, the endpoint was secure, but the human process bypassed it all. You really have to use secure FTP instead of unencrypted email for that kind of sensitive stuff.
Okay, so that is confidentiality enforcing the perimeter of access. The next letter in the triad is I for integrity. And looking through our technical source material, there's a fascinating mechanical detail here.
Oh, the mathematical proofs.
Yeah. The texts reference the IEEE 802.3 frame format and something called a 4-byte cyclical redundancy check, the CRC. That's alongside the IP packet header checksum.
Right.
Now, a business leader doesn't need to write the code for a checksum, but why is this mathematical process so critical to a manager?
Because integrity is fundamentally about trust. It is the mathematical proof that data was not altered, corrupted, or maliciously modified in transit.
Okay, so like a digital seal.
Precisely. Imagine a hospital transmitting a patient's digital telemetry to a central monitoring station. If that data is altered by even a single bit, the consequences are catastrophic. The CRC and the IP checksums prove that the data is pristine.
So how does the math actually prove it? What's happening inside the switch?
At a high level, when a device builds a network frame, it runs the payload data through a complex polynomial algorithm. The result of that math is a fixed-size string of bits, the checksum, which it appends to the frame.
Got it.
That frame travels across the cables. When the receiving device ingests that frame, it runs the payload through the exact same polynomial algorithm. It then compares its mathematical answer to the checksum appended by the sender.
And if the answers match, the integrity is mathematically guaranteed.
Exactly. And if they don't match, it means something happened in transit. Maybe it was a malicious attack, or maybe just interference on the cable. Either way, the protocol automatically drops that packet.
I love diving into the mechanics of that. It makes integrity tangible. And then the final pillar is availability, which, on the surface seems like the simplest one. The system just needs to be up.
It seems simple, but mechanically, it is often the most complex and the most expensive to maintain. Availability ensures that the network is actually accessible to authorized users when they need it.
Right.
But consider the dependencies. You need an authorized user, obviously. You need highly available DNS so users can find the servers. You need network time protocol, or NTP, synchronizing the clocks.
Wait, why the clocks?
Because if your server clocks drift, cryptographic certificates become invalid and authentication fails. It locks everyone out.
Oh, wow, yeah. And you need the physical connections, too.
Exactly. Uptime isn't just a tech metric. It's a business survival metric. You're usually targeting 99.8% or higher. Hitting that requires massive capital investment in redundant architecture.
Okay, I want to use an analogy here to ground this triad. Think of a physical bank. Confidentiality is the vault lock, right?
Yeah.
Integrity is a die pack, ensuring the money isn't tampered with. And availability means the bank is actually open for business. But I have a question.
Go for it.
Does a single network control ever guarantee all three of these at once? Like, if I am a CIO, can I just deploy a robust VPN and say we have achieved this CIA triad?
The answer is absolutely not. Security requires a complex matrix of controls because no single tool covers the entire triad perfectly.
Really? Not even a high-end VPN?
No. An IPsec tunnel provides incredible confidentiality and integrity through encryption, but it provides zero availability. If the router loses power, your encrypted data is completely unavailable. You have to layer redundant hardware underneath it.
So we have this philosophical foundation, but we have to apply it everywhere. Which leads us to mapping the battlefield. The academic frameworks divide a typical IT infrastructure into 7 distinct domains.
Yes, the 7 domains are the structural map of the enterprise. They are the user, workstation, LAN, LAN-to-WAN, WAN, remote access, and system application domains.
And it's vital for a corporate manager to view these domains properly, regardless of company size. The text emphasizes that these apply to all IT environments, not just massive enterprises.
Right. The scale changes, but the domains remain consistent. Let's look at the LAN to WAN domain, for example.
That's the border where the private LAN hits the public internet.
Exactly. This is where firewalls and demilitarized zones, or DMZs, sit. And crucially, this is where data leakage prevention, or DLP, software blocks unencrypted sensitive data from escaping the network.
Okay, but let's explore how DLP works here. If modern web traffic is overwhelmingly encrypted, like a user going to a cloud drive via HTTPS, doesn't the encryption blind the firewall?
That is a fantastic technical nuance. Yes, if the firewall just passes the encrypted traffic, DLP is useless. To make it work, the organization has to implement something called SSO/TLS inspection.
Which is basically what?
Essentially, the corporate firewall performs an authorized man-in-the-middle intercept on its own employees.
Wait, really? That sounds intense.
It is. The firewall intercepts the connection, decrypts the traffic using its own trusted certificate, scans the raw payload for sensitive data, and if it's clean, re-encrypts it and sends it out.
That requires massive computational power on the firewall.
It does, but it's the only mechanical way to enforce data leakage prevention at that boundary.
Wow. Okay, let's look at another domain, the remote access domain.
This domain is fraught with architectural vulnerabilities if not designed well. Let me give you a specific example of weak layer design from the text.
Okay.
An enterprise uses an IPsec VPN with full encryption, mathematically impenetrable, but they fail to enable multi-factor authentication, or MFA.
It's like a huge gap.
It is. Without MSA, if an attacker phishes an employee's password, the impenetrable encryption doesn't matter. The attacker just authenticates and walks right in.
Yeah, that completely breaks the defense. And, the shift to remote work has completely blurred the lines between the user, workstation, and remote access domains.
Absolutely. The traditional perimeter has dissolved.
Which makes executive oversight of these specific boundaries more critical than ever. We're defending this highly distributed infrastructure, which brings us to a really vital clarification of terminology.
Deciphering the terms.
Right. In corporate meetings, I constantly hear managers conflate the terms risk, threat, and vulnerability. They use them interchangeably.
Which is a massive strategic failure. We have to explicitly define them based on the text. A threat is a harmful action that can damage assets.
Like a hurricane or a ransomware syndicate, the external force.
Exactly. A vulnerability is a weakness, like a bug in software code or a misconfigured firewall rule.
So the vulnerability is the unlocked door.
Yes. And a risk is the actual exposure that materializes when a threat exploits a vulnerability.
Okay, let's ground this with specific threats from the text. Earlier, I mentioned the evil twin at the airport. How does that actually work?
The evil twin leverages how Wi-Fi protocols operate. An attacker sets up a fake Wi-Fi network mimicking a production network broadcasting the exact same name.
But with a stronger signal.
Right. Your laptop automatically connects to the stronger signal. The attacker is now a man in the middle, capturing your keystrokes.
That is terrifying. What about phishing versus man in the middle? People confuse those constantly.
They are distinct. Phishing is a social engineering threat. Emails luring users to click malicious links. It attacks the human vulnerability. Man in the middle is highly technical packet interception.
And then we have advanced persistent threats, or APTs.
Right. Where attackers remain stealthy for long-term reconnaissance, they map the network over months before finally executing their objective.
Speaking of execution, the text calls out CryptoLocker. We need to clarify ransomware here.
Yes. CryptoLocker is tied to ransomware, which means extorting money for decryption keys. Managers often confuse this with just a denial of service or DOS attack.
Because DOS is just degraded network performance by flooding it with traffic, right?
Exactly. DOS takes the system offline. Ransomware actually takes your data hostage.
So on the risk side, there's a big difference between degraded network performance and a critical risk, like a core switch going down without redundancy or VLAN hopping taking place.
Huge difference in business impact.
Okay, I have a pushback scenario for you on vulnerabilities.
Let's hear it.
Say a company has a legacy system full of vulnerabilities, but we literally cannot upgrade it because it runs a critical factory machine. If we patch it, the machine breaks. Are we just sitting ducks?
No, not at all. This is where you introduce the concept of a compensating security control.
What does that mean?
It's a specific solution deployed to support legacy systems that cannot meet modern security standards. You essentially build an impenetrable fortress around that vulnerable machine.
By isolating it.
Yes. You place it on a dedicated, non-routable microsegment and completely cut it off from the internet and the rest of the corporate network.
That makes total sense. But how does an organization systematically identify where all these vulnerabilities are in the first place?
That requires moving from theory to action. You conduct a network security risk assessment.
Which is the manager's playbook.
Exactly. The process begins with identifying assets, people, process, technology, and information. Then you identify the threats and vulnerabilities.
And then you assess the current state, using both quantitative and qualitative analysis.
Right, followed by evaluating the risks through a business impact analysis. But the most critical part of this entire process is assigning ownership.
Let's focus on that managerial detail from the text. Why does ownership have to be assigned to an individual?
Because ownership cannot be assigned to a team or a department. If a committee owns a risk, there is no absolute accountability. It just gets endlessly debated.
Right, the diffusion of responsibility.
Exactly. You need a named executive whose performance bonus is tied to mitigating that risk.
And when they design the mitigation, they have to navigate compliance frameworks, right?
Yes. Standards define frameworks. For high-level coverage, you might use the NIST cybersecurity framework. For highly granular mapping, you'd use the secure controls framework.
What about legal requirements?
They are strict. For U.S. federal agencies, it's FISMA. For banking and financial institutions, it's the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, or GLBA.
Right, and we should clarify, GLBA provides the safeguard rules for U.S. banking, not GDPR. I hear managers throw GDPR around as the ultimate privacy law for everything.
Yeah, GDPR is the EU's data protection regulation. It's totally separate from U.S. banking security requirements under GLBA.
Good clarification. Now, we talk about risk mitigation, but what about risk transfer? Can an organization just choose to avoid all risk?
Avoiding all risk is basically impossible. It would be financially ruinous or halt business operations entirely. If you want to avoid the risk of a web server being breached, you have to unplug it from the internet.
Which ruins your business.
Yeah.
So you transfer the residual risk instead.
Exactly. Cyber insurance doesn't avoid risk. It transfers the financial burden of the aftermath.
Which transitions us to building the actual fortress, the defense-in-depth layered security architecture.
Yes. You assume every control will eventually fail, so you design concentric layers. Moving from the outermost to the innermost, we start with administrative safeguards.
That's your policies, procedures, user security awareness, and HR onboarding and offboarding.
Right. Then moving one layer deeper, we hit physical security.
And I want to highlight a surprising fact from the text here. Data center air conditioning, the HVAC, is considered a critical physical security control.
It absolutely is, alongside building access. Because if the HVAC fails, the servers overheat and shut down. You lose all availability.
That's wild. Okay, inside the physical layer is perimeter security.
This is where you have your DMZs and firewalls connecting the private IP network to the public internet.
But deeper still is network security.
Right, your internal access controls, segmentation, and L2, L3 networks. Carving up the flat network,
And then application security.
which uses a software development lifecycle, or SDLC, approach. It involves RBAC and securing the software code itself.
And finally, at the very center, data security.
The ultimate target. This involves data encryption at rest and in transit. The text specifically calls out TLS 1.3 here.
Why version 1.3 specifically?
Because it requires only one round-trip session to establish the secure tunnel, drastically reducing latency. And just to clarify, TLS replaces SSL, not SSH.
Right, SSH is for secure command line administration. Okay, so thinking about these layers, I compare this to a medieval castle. You have the moat, the outer wall, the inner keep, and the vault.
It's a good analogy, but let me refine it a bit. In modern networks, the data in the vault can be accessed from the outside via the web.
Ah, so you intentionally build a bridge over the walls.
Exactly. Which makes application security the critical drawbridge. If the application code is vulnerable, the attacker just walks right over the perimeter firewalls and into the vault.
So we have all these layers to implement. How does a corporate executive actually execute this strategy? What's the timeline and priority?
The golden rule of gap remediation from the text is that priority goes to risks and threats that pertain to humans and sensitive data first.
Why humans and data first?
Because humans are the most vulnerable attack vector and sensitive data represents the highest impact of a breach. So a data security assessment is the crucial first step.
Right, you have to know where the data is before you start creating VLAN strategies or hardening computer images.
Exactly.
But let's bring up the reality of resource constraints. What if a company just doesn't have the budget to hire a full-time security team to manage all this?
The text introduces a great concept for this, engaging a VCISO or virtual CISO.
Like a part-time chief information security officer.
Yes. They act as an overlay to support and drive these gap remediation efforts without the massive cost of a full-time executive.
So corporate managers can leverage a VCISO to basically bridge the gap between technical IT staff and the boardroom.
Precisely. They bring the strategic vision and direct the execution.
That is a highly agile solution. All right, let's recap the primary managerial takeaway from this deep dive.
Okay.
Network security is not an IT roadblock. It is a fundamental business enabler that requires layered defense, continuous risk assessment, and individual accountability.
Exactly.
And tying this back to our opening hook, avoiding the catastrophic failure of a core switch or an evil twin breach at an airport requires executive-level understanding of these very principles.
You absolutely cannot protect the business if you don't understand the architecture.
So true. I want to reiterate our early engagement ask. Thank you so much for joining us. Please make sure to navigate to the description below to access the resource links and diagrams.
And definitely review the channels for other corporate IT playlists.
Yeah, we have other great deep dives on the channel like digital forensics or the network and systems security series.
They are fantastic resources.
Now, what do we have coming up next?
Next up is a high-level strategic look at Chapter 15, Network Troubleshooting. And I want to explicitly note that this will be our 15th and final chapter in this series.
The grand finale.
It is. It will be a masterclass in NOC ticketing workflows and process of elimination diagnostics that corporate leaders absolutely cannot afford to miss.
I am really looking forward to that final episode. But before we sign off today, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought that wasn't explicitly covered in the text.
Oh, let's hear it.
As our physical world and digital networks become completely unified through IoT smart buildings, autonomous vehicles, does the concept of physical security eventually become obsolete?
Oh, wow. That's a wild thought.
Right. As the perimeter dissolves, does the physical human body become the only true perimeter left to defend?
That completely changes how we view infrastructure roadmaps.
It really does.
Oh.
So I want you to ask yourself, are your current security controls genuinely protecting your data, or just checking a compliance box?
Yep.
Align the strategy, optimize the network. Until next time, keep your business connected, your assets visible, and your infrastructure secure.